Good afternoon. I thank you all for being here, and I am especially grateful for the presence of professors, and I hope to pronounce correctly. I have a practice. Haiyan, Fernanda Medeiros, Haiyan, supposedly. José Luiz Jobim, Fernanda Medeiros, Larissa, Moreira, Fidalgo, José Luiz Rangel, and all of you. This is actually going to be a conversation, so we are all going to be engaged in the conversation. In this first conversation, which hopefully will grow into a transnational research project. I call our meeting a conversation instead of a formal conference with the presentation, discussion of roundup papers, because I would like to see it as a brainstorming session around a research problem. The research problem initially proposed refers to the special location of our cultures, Brazilian, Chinese, Latin American, in the so-called world system. In other words, and then we have a series of research questions. Is it possible to rethink literary and cultural studies from afar, namely from our non-hegemonic circumstance? Is there a theoretical framework to be developed from this predicament? Are there concepts and approaches to spring from our special gaze, whose lenses are also shaped by the distance? Naturally, this research question may be enhanced, enlarged, changed, or even abandoned and replaced. It does not matter. What really counts is that this research question brings us together for our first meeting. As some of you may know, I have already done some work in this direction through the unfolding of the theoretical framework of the poetics of emulation, combined with the concepts of hegemonic and non-hegemonic contexts, proposed as a nuanced understanding of the complex relations between center and periphery, and even semi-periphery. If our transnational research projects comes into fruition, I will certainly take the advantage of this opportunity to finally write a new book only devoted to the hypothesis of the poetics of emulation. Jobim is telling me in the past 5 years that I have to stop reading Olavo de Carvalho. I have to stop my concern with the far right extremists. I have to come back to the poetics of emulation. I will do it. I will write a theoretical book only on the poetics of emulation. Cultural war will be for later. So I will write this book devoted to this hypothesis, as I am sure that all of you will also have research projects to be brought forward. Let us then start. Each one of us will have 15 minutes for an initial statement. And let me say once more, you all are invited to be part of the conversation. It's not an academic, it's not a formal conference. It's an academic conversation as a brainstorm session. So 15 minutes, so that everyone can actually have a saying. And 15 minutes for the initial statement. I will return after the last speaker, José Luiz Rangel, and then our conversation will take place. A final request. Please, since we are recording this session, let me ask you to briefly introduce yourself for the benefit of the ones who will later watch the video. I have not introduced myself. My name is João Cezar de Castro Rocha, and I'm a full professor of comparative literature at UERJ. If you all agree, I propose that we follow the usual order, starting with Professor Haiyan, because she's the true scholar from afar. And then proceed to listen to Professor Jobim from Universidade Federal Fluminense. We then will follow with Professor Fernanda Medeiros, Larissa Moreira Fidalgo, and José Luiz Rangel, and naturally all of you who are here. So I think we may start. Professor Haiyan, please. Professor Jobim, you may take your place as well. Oh, and when the conversation ends, we are going to have a reception in honor of Professor Haiyan.
Thank you so much. Do I need to Thank you for the introduction. Oh, really?
Especially, please tell us your name, but I'm afraid of asking that.
Okay. 大家下午好，我叫任海燕，我来自湖南长沙，中国。Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ren Haiyan, and I'm from Changsha, Hunan province in China. I'm from Hunan Normal University. I'm a full professor there. And also I'm the vice director of the Humboldt Center for Transdisciplinary Studies. Okay. João gave me the assignment of a 15-minute talk yesterday. So I'm really serious about this. I wrote it down. But I wanted to be in a conversation, to have a conversation with you. But in order to prevent myself from meandering talk and full of digressions, so I think I'd better follow my line of thought. Okay. For me, yes, I indeed traveled from afar. I took over 24 hours plane to be here. And I think the real purpose of travel is to know yourself better. So that's why I'm here, to know myself better. And I think reading foreign literature, or to use João's term, studying literature from afar, is the same. It leads you away, but at the same time, it is homecoming, anew, of course. The first piece of foreign literature canon I read, if we do not count mythological stories and fairy tales, it was Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It was given to me as an award by the school when I was 12. Yes, 12. And that was my first encounter with the Western canon. And since then, this list keeps getting longer and longer. But at a certain point of my life, I started to wonder, why is that my reading map is made up with a long list of foreign names? Where are the Chinese writers? Indeed, I can name quite a number of Chinese novelists and their works, but somehow I prefer classical poetry and classical novels. The Dream of the Red Mansion in particular. For your information, it is commonly agreed that in China there are four only classical novels. So intuitively, I sense that there's something wrong, something out of the place in modern Chinese novels. And it is almost like predestined. I did my PhD dissertation on Robinson Crusoe, which is generally considered the first English novel, and an incredibly seminal novel that has become a modern myth. So as an outsider of the Western culture and Western history, the attraction of Robinson Crusoe does not lie in its religious dimension, nor does it lie in the master-slave dichotomy. As a typical Chinese who longs for stability and longevity, I see in this story the Western imagination of good life. So taking Robinson Crusoe as a lens, I get glimpses of the imagination of good life, both in the West and in China. The unknown island in Robinson Crusoe, due to its isolation from the continent and anonymity, promises absolute freedom, thus providing countless possibilities for experimental life. When Robinson Crusoe returned home a triumphant manner at the end of the novel, he assumed the epitome of the good life at the time. Thus, through the desert island and adventures, he set up a model for good life that lost individualism and that aligned with the imagination for overseas conquest and colonization. This vision of good life, when translated into Chinese, is completely altered. Robinson Crusoe was among the first foreign stories translated into Chinese. And the first published translation is called 绝岛漂流记. It was completed in 1898, and the publication has to wait 4 more years. So it was published in 1902. As part of the efforts to seek new voices from foreign country at that time in China. So the vision in this translation is directed towards the renewal and transformation of the Chinese society. So it is not a revision, but a transvision. Transvision, as I define it, refers to the translation that constructs and projects a vision of the world that transcends the vision of the original through the act of translation. This transcendence contains a multilateral relationality, transcending both the vision of the original work and the vision of the translated. So in the case of Robinson Crusoe, the transvision is what I would call Nalaistic. Nalaism is a concept coined by Lu Xun, the literary giant in modern Chinese history. And Nalai is a most frequently used daily vocabulary consisting of two Chinese characters, Na and Lai, whose literal meaning is take over or bring it. So Lu Xun coined this term by welding together the most common vocabulary, almost a catchphrase, in everyday life with the imported expression of ism. This is something foreign. So this in itself may be deemed a form of nalai. Using the metaphor of a new master of an old mansion, he gives a vivid illustration to the generative, assimilative, and miscellaneous nature of the concept, nalaism. This is what he said. In short, we must take things from the outside. We must either use them or store them, or destroy them. Then the master becomes a new master, and the mansion becomes a new mansion. However, the prerequisite is that this person should be calm, brave, discerning, and unselfish. Without nalai, one cannot become a new person. And without nalai, literature and art cannot become new literature and art. So taking constant renewal of the local literature and art as the aim, the principle of nalai is proposed as a response to the oscillation in Chinese society's attitudes towards the West between shutting our door up and delivering to their door. So with no intention to oppose delivering or self-promotion to the West, Lu Xun, however, believed that the imperative for China at that critical moment, early 20th century, is to nalai, to take over, to renew the thought, and thus renewing the society. For this purpose, he proposed to nalai while observing that traditional Chinese principle of etiquette, courtesy, and reciprocity. Since then, nalaism has become synonymous with selective assimilation for improvement and has been a slogan widely circulated and used in Chinese society until today. So the first translation or transvision of Robinson Crusoe encapsulates the principles of nalaism. The value of this myth for the translator, whose name is Shen Zufen, is twofold. First, the adventurous, enterprising spirit it embodies. He believes this is something that Chinese did not have at the time. And the second is the sense of hope it passes on. You cannot survive without this hope. By adopting the strategy of domestication, Shen makes significant modification to balance the need for the adventurous spirit of individuals and to downplay individualism. So according to Fei Xiaotong, Chinese society is fundamentally rural, based on rituals and customs rather than law and reason. Intrinsic to such a society is a sense of order or norm obtained through familiarity with these rituals and customs. So this order is largely hierarchical. Cai Yuanpei, who used to be the president of Peking University, he summarized the Chinese vision of the world as follows. The essence of the world is Daode, the way and the ethics, meaning when crystallized in the physical world, it's hierarchical order. So removing elements that the translator Shen Zufen he considered irrelevant to the renewal of the national spirit, such as religion and slavery, he replaces the individualism with the Chinese social order in the story. And this social order takes family rather than the individual as the unit of society. So as Shen, the translator of Robinson Crusoe as Shen, perceived it, The individual is embedded in the community of family. That is, the individual is an individual within the family, not an individual free from the family structure. The realization of the value of the individual, be it for independence or freedom, should not be confined to the good of the individual per se. Instead, it is realized within the family structure and, more importantly, for a greater good. So crucial to this vision is the sense of responsibility. This reconstruction or rewriting, or whatever you would call it, is structural to the original story, and it is absolutely non-Eurocentric. Thus, unlike Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, who departs from a definite place to explore and colonize in a faraway place with an unknown destination, Shen Zufen's protagonist in this, what he called translation, leaves with a clear intention to return. And this translation inspires me to step outside of the framework or coordination of power, a perspective that is prevalent in today's world. In the imagination of good life, it is necessary to include more than power. Familial responsibility and social responsibility, for instance, are equally important. And of course, in the Western revision of the Robinson Crusoe myth, there are also authors who downplays the power game in the original. French writer Michel Dufnier is a case in point. In his debut novel, Friday, by resorting to Greek mythology and philosophy, he changed the nature of Robinson's experiment from a colonialist spatial experiment to a temporal experiment on immortality. For Dufnier, Defoe's Robinson Crusoe's spatial experiment on good life creates nothing but a homogeneous world to the modern world. There is nothing experimental there. So he redesigned the experiment. By making his Robinson rejects invitation to return to the civilized world, he transformed the story from a utopian experiment based on the desire for spatial expansion into a Uchronian one based on temporality. Thus, he conducts a temporal experiment aiming at immortality. And this immortality is crystallized through harmonious coexistence. So in this temporal experiment, Dufnier reshaped the relationship between Robinson and Friday, transforming it from a subject-object binary to an equal and intimate relationship, in which Robinson becomes a twin to Friday through carefully observing and imitating the latter. Defined by this relationship, Friday, the other, he, who was originally a stranger, is intimately connected with me, Robinson. So as is portrayed in the novel, this state of intimacy and harmonious coexistence is an alias for happiness. So eventually, Robinson realizes the transition from the limbo to the city of the sun, a symbol of ultimate goodness and the realm of the absolute. What can be more ideal than this? So from spatial experiment to temporal experiment, Friday represents a change from an existence based on benefits and profits, an existence aimed at self-sufficiency and maximizing interests of the subject, to an existence based on relations, or relational existence. This relational existence implies the elimination or removal of preconceived positions as well as assumptions, so as to embrace different possibilities that different relations might bring. In this relational existence, Friday is not only the condition or precondition for the existence of Robinson, but also the condition for a meaningful life. So this confirms the judgment that coexistence is the prerequisite for existence. In the transition from the spatial experiment to the temporal experiment, a fundamental shift occurred, a shift from the principle of modern subjectivity to the principle of otherness. If we agree that modern philosophy is a philosophy based on the concept of subjectivity, this shift marks an attempt to step out of the confinement of modernity and explore new possibilities for life and existence. Dufnier's temporal experiment brings to my mind a traditional imagination of good life in China. It is exemplified in the story of 桃花源, sometimes translated into peach blossom source. So this is a story composed by Tao Yuanming, who lived between 365 and 427, that is the end of 4th century and early 5th century. And it's a story that's been constantly referred to nowadays still. So it tells the story of a fisherman who accidentally found a tiny cave in a mountain at the end of a peach blossom forest while fishing on the river. He passed through the cave and thus entered a blessed land whose existence is unknown to the world that he comes from. So indeed, this is a spatially isolated place, similar to Robinson Crusoe's island. But Taohuayuan is situated within the cognitive framework of shanshui, mountains and waters. This is a Chinese cognitive framework. So while Crusoe's island, far out in the sea, belongs to the land sea or continental sea framework. So shanshui is landscape, but it's also the Chinese worldview. It represents rootedness and is related to territorial imagination of life, whereas the continental sea framework is outgoing, mobile, and migratory. It is true that Taohuayuan is also located in a non-existent place, a location that even with marks can never be found, as is told in the story. But this is not the morality of the story. The essence of this story is the suspense of time, and which this suspense of time in the Chinese context is an equivalent to eternity. So the residences told the fishermen that their ancestors found this place while trying to escape the wars hundreds of years ago. And since then, as the fisherman observes, their life is suspended in time. Through the eyes of the fisherman, the idealness of Taohuayuan is expressed through orderness and harmony, everybody leading a life at ease and in tranquility. At the core of this imagination, an imagination that privileges time over space, is the idea of sustenance and stability brought about by the harmonious relationship between people of all ages, regardless of sex, and the harmonious coexistence of humans with nature. So although both emphasizing the harmonious coexistence, the difference between Duchnay's Friday and the story of Taohuayuan is obvious. The previous, albeit its emphasis on relational existence, is a story of the individual. But the latter is a story of the group or the collective. Thus the visions are different. Now I'm starting to figure out where does the feeling of out of place in my readings of modern Chinese novels come from. Ian Watt is absolutely right in arguing that Robinson Crusoe is a myth of modern individualism. And the rise of novel indeed is the consequence of the rise of individualism. In many senses, modern Chinese novels aspire to imitate, use Ron's term, the Western narrative discourse. But in most cases, as is indicated in Professor Chen Xiaoming's essay in our new book, these efforts are not very successful. The Chinese narrative tradition, a tradition that usually takes historical records as literature, is too strong to be discarded or overlooked. And it is the tension between these two visions of life that creates a certain awkwardness. And Robinson Crusoe thus becomes a lens that enables me to be acutely conscious of some of the concepts and elements in myself that I could only vaguely sense in the past. Reading literature from afar not only allows me to view and examine the West from a Chinese perspective, but also inspires self-reflection. So let me return to João's initiative. Indeed, from afar, we cannot naturalize the other, and the critical approach tends to be sharp. But could this sharpness rise not from the self-other dichotomy? Could this sharpness be the natural consequence of the desire for better self-knowledge and better knowledge of the world, for improvement? Could it be that we read and care about literatures from afar is because we would like to take them as mirrors for reflection and self-reflection? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
谢谢。
不用谢。
Okay. So, to avoid digressions, I'm already prepared a text here so that I won't take more than what is allowed by João Cezar here. Okay? So, I'm José Luiz Jobim. I'm a full professor of literature at Universidade Federal Fluminense, a researcher and member of the Board of Advisors of the National Research Council, CNPq, and a scientist of the state of Rio de Janeiro, cientista do nosso estado, at the Rio de Janeiro Research Foundation, FAPERJ. Since at least the 19th century, the colonial experience has left its indelible marks, redrawing territorial maps and forcing contact between different languages and cultures. While the reconfiguration of borders in Africa, with all its consequences, dates back in the second half of that century, Ibero-America, however, has a different history in which independence and local nationalism follow one another. At the beginning of the second millennium, we seem to be far removed from the seizure of territories in various parts of the globe, which generated the need to understand, in order to better control the population and living conditions in the colonies, through a series of bibliographic productions, the accounts of travelers, the testimony of transplanted Europeans, the work of researchers in various fields of knowledge. However, although a large number of texts have emerged today that revise colonial representations of the landscapes, populations, and life in general in the former colonies, there is still resistance to this revision, as recently demonstrated by the British bestseller Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, written by a professor of moral theology at Oxford University. The very difficulty of publishing this book, which had its contract with the publisher, Bloomsbury, cancelled on the grounds that public sentiment was not in favor of its content, before being published by William Collins, demonstrates the size of the opposition to analyzing the history of colonialism in the former metropolises, in order to make clearer its associations with social practices that are widely condemned today, such as slavery or racism. On the other hand, the linguistic and cultural resistance of populations dominated by colonial expansion has also left its mark. The Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz Fernandez, in his classic Contrapunteo Cubano del Tabaco y del Azúcar, coined in the term transculturation to make sense of a situation in which, due to coloniality, we thought not only from the point of view of cultural and linguistic hegemony as configured in the term acculturation. When Ortiz used the term transculturation, he explained that his intention was to replace, at least in part, the term acculturation, which at the time was gaining ground in anthropological terminology. Transculturation, for him, would better express the many different phenomena that originated in Cuba as a result of the very complex transmutation of cultures that took place there. Neither those who were there nor those who arrived there would have remained the same. Transculturation would consist of a kind of syncretism, which in turn would be a product of the encounter in Cuba of these different cultures transplanted to the New World, in which, for those who shared that space, there would have to be a readjustment to adapt to local circumstances, themselves altered by the intercultural and interlingual contact. In any case, colonial and anti-colonial thinking still generates questions and consequences. So let's address the questions Professor João Cezar de Castro Rocha proposed. I will now repeat them because I don't know if you have heard them in the beginning. Quote, on the one hand, how do Brazilian and Chinese scholars read canonical works from the Western tradition? Are there theoretical and methodological contributions related to our residencia en la tierra, according to the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda? Have we not yet unfolded the theoretical consequences of this anthropological gaze from afar? We cannot naturalize the other. Therefore, our critical approach tends to be particularly sharp or sharpened. On the other hand, what happens when, for instance, a Chinese scholar specializes in Latin American literature, or when a Brazilian scholar specializes in Hispanic American authors? How, for instance, is Miguel de Cervantes read in Hunan, Daniel Defoe in Beijing, Shakespeare in Rio de Janeiro, or Paul Celan in Macau? Is it possible to read Othello and indeed Shakespeare's work from Cyprus? How to conceptualize this circumstance? End of quote. The first question, how do Brazilian and Chinese scholars read canonical works from the Western tradition, already implies a series of others. Which canon are we talking about? That is, a canon limited only by Western geolocation. When we talk about Brazilian and Chinese scholars, do we want to explore what's common for scholars or what can be shared in the experience of these two countries regarding colonialism in their past histories, and which could be somehow present in the way of working with works from Western canon, whatever this means? We could also think in the context of Brazil or China about which foreign literatures are chosen to be included in the university courses and which others are invisible in these courses. And also think about why, to this day, some European literatures, namely from the UK, France, Germany, and to a lesser extent Italy and Spain, are included in university curricula, while others from the same continent are not, Holland, Czech Republic, Sweden, etc. I believe that although scholars in Brazil, when working with hegemonic literatures, can have a distance view, so to speak, a view that can point out problems that would not be pointed out by colleagues who teach these literatures in hegemonic countries. This is the result of intellectual work. In other words, in order to go beyond the uncritical importation of the hegemonic ways of seeing literatures in their countries of origin, ideologically consolidated ways of seeing, we need a critical attitude that points out the flaws in what is presented as natural. I think the Robinson Crusoe translation is a very good example of this. Another fruitful field for contemporary debate, but one that also dialogues with the colonial, anti-colonial question, is that of literary and cultural circulation. We know that languages, cultures, and literatures circulate beyond their supposed or real origins, and that it is necessary to investigate if, how, why, when they circulate. Sorry about that. That's, oh, sorry. I'll start again. Another Another fruitful field for contemporary debate, but one that also dialogues with the colonial, anti-colonial question, is that of literary and cultural circulation. We know that languages, cultures, and literature circulate beyond their supposed or real origins, and that it is necessary to investigate if, how, why, when they circulate, and the material, social, and historical factors involved in circulation. This circulation also refers to translation, whether in the linguistic or cultural sense, since, among other things, the circulation of books, periodicals, newspapers, archives, and websites on and or off the internet often involves translating them. Translation policies, in turn, are also linguistic policies. It is no coincidence that the dominant language in two political powers of the past and present, the UK and the United States, is also the one that predominates on the internet, or that it is the main language from which translations are made into other languages, while at the same time it is the one in which the least number of translations from other languages are made in relative terms. The percentage is less than 3%, although the University of Rochester website called 3% suspects that figure is even lower. If Brazilian and Chinese scholars who teach hegemonic literatures always have the national canon of these literatures as a reference, on the other hand, the distance between these scholars and the reasons for choosing the works in that canon can have different effects. The reasons for the choices of a Brazilian or Chinese professor are not the same as those of their colleagues on the hegemonic countries, not only because they are not subject to the same national logic, but also because the literary themes and interests in Brazil and China are not the same as those of the former colonial powers. In the West, as a result of the formation of academic or literary communities around more or less shared ideas about literature from the beginning of the 20th century on, movements were named Russian formalism, exact structuralism, new criticism, new historicism, etc., etc., etc. And a lot of research was done about their duration, their place, their relationship with other orientations and anticipations derived from other fields of knowledge. And we also know that the structures of repetition resulting from community assumptions also generate questions about their respective scope and limits. If there are always presuppositions that are not verbalized, of which we're not always aware, but which form or guide our understanding a priori, trying to verbalize them, giving them visibility, highlight them, is an important task for all those who work in literary studies, not least to reflect on their scope and limits, which is the case. In this way, we can avoid the perpetuation of certain orientations that can become a latent or undeclared norm. Our Chinese colleague, Zhang Longxi, who was here some time ago, for example, has already drawn attention to the problem of using European criteria as if they were universal to judge non-European cultures. But he also pointed out that the current emphasis on cultural difference and the supposed internal validity of disparate value systems can lead to a denial of the possibility of intercultural understanding. For him, Longxi, the perspective should be different, derived from the idea of a dialectical relationship between unity and diversity, an important principle in Western thought, but also in traditional Chinese philosophy. We could come to the conclusions that Difference and affinity, the specific and the general, the diverse and the universal, are complementary to each other, with emphasis placed on one or the other depending on the circumstances. Because for Longxi, difference and affinity have no value in and on and of themselves, which is why it makes no sense to ask, without a specific context, whether we should place emphasis on difference or affinity in comparative studies. So that's it.
Let me invite now Professor Fernanda Medeiros and Larissa Moreira. Traffic jam. Imagine Beijing.
Jobim, yours?
Já está desligado.
Oh my God. Let me open João Cezar's email here with the prompts. Hi everyone, my name is Fernanda Medeiros. I teach English literature at UERJ. I am an associate professor there, and for the past 15 years, my research object has been the work of Shakespeare. Yeah? I don't think there is anything more canonical than Shakespeare, for the good and for the bad. So when I read João Cezar's invitation, and one of the questions proposed was, how do we teach and learn Shakespeare in Rio? I felt this was sort of my cue, my prompt to speak. Yeah. So I don't have any general reflections as Jobim and Jen presented, but just a few ideas and very much drawn from my own experience of teaching English literature to my students, especially undergraduates at UERJ. So I've been there for 27 years, and I've taught most of the time the evening courses. So my students would come from Afar, so I think they are much further than Shakespeare, than perhaps Jen in China, yeah? So they come from the outskirts of Rio. I probably was the only member of somewhere near Zona Sul, the South Zone, in my classrooms. And I've had all sorts of experiences. So if I think of about my beginnings at UERJ 27 years ago, I would say that the students were more receptive and more willing and more curious and feeling more empowered, although the word was not used then. Yeah, this idea of empowerment, because after all, learning Shakespeare, and to most of them, reading Macbeth in the undergraduate course was their first experience with Shakespeare. So it was quite empowering and an asset. Yeah, so I think there is a question of status, which was quite interesting. And of course, the surprise and the sort of bliss many of them felt of starting to recognize elements in the culture which they never thought were Shakespearean. But because of having read Macbeth, they would know that sound and fury was something coined by Shakespeare, or, I'm ashamed to wear a heart so white. I don't know, quotes that they would hear, perhaps in very popular items. They were Shakespearean, in fact. And I always told them, of course, João, about the passion Machado de Assis had for Shakespeare. And I always told them that what Oswaldo de Andrade said in one of his interviews about trying to define the concept of anthropophagy, and being asked by one journalist about the meaning of the concept. And he said, Oswaldo said, my friend, in an age that has, he said to the journalist, something like that, in an age that has produced James Joyce, Thomas Mann, Shakespeare, I want to be with them. I would like to be a character of Shakespeare. No, I would like to be Shakespeare. And I always reminded my students that Shakespeare was not that far. So Coming closer to the present, what I have been feeling a more resistance to the idea of canon. All those threads of cancellation, the closer we get to these cultural and social network logics, the cancellation culture. So Shakespeare is white, European, probably a cis man, or at most bisexual, but more likely a heterosexual, a father of 3 children, provincial. So why are we still reading Shakespeare? And one of my students asked not very long ago in a classroom, we were reading Macbeth, and I pointed out to them that we had from 2018 to 2022, this was probably 2023, we had the experience of tyranny very close to us, right there in the center of Brazil. So how good to be able to read a very deep study on tyranny when we read Macbeth. So this is, I told them, this is so close to us now. This is closest than ever. So although I would say this, to things like that, to the students in class, one student raised her hand and said one day, "Professor, can we read something more social?" These I'm translating directly from Portuguese. Can we read something more social in our classes? And I said, more social than a deep study in tyranny now in Brazil? I can't think of anything. So this sort of a discomfort or a dislike for the canon was something that I felt that has been rising recently, for the good and for the bad. Indeed, I think, although my major at UERJ is English literature, it's not even British literature, it's English literature, which I particularly find amazing that a state university offers such a rich course with North American and English literatures as our undergraduate course offers. So for those who want to teach English, even if not literature, but the English language, which is a big work market in Brazil, they have loads of courses on foreign Anglophonic literatures. So, but even so, I've been feeling this resistance. So I think it's important to keep questioning the canon, but at the same time, this sort of gratuitous resistance to the canon because it's canonical, I think it's also futile. And then, in correlation to that, in correlation to the subject matter, teaching Shakespeare in Rio, in Brazil, in a university whose students tend to be peripheral, I think it's a very rich experience, and the trajectory would be more or less like that as I have described to you, growing, perhaps resistance, bigger than it was 30 years ago now. I also think, and this is something I also try to bring to my classes, that there is the canon of texts, the Western canon, and although I know nothing about Chinese literature or Chinese culture, but when I learned that your first novel, or in English, was Pride and Prejudice, the canon becomes a common language for you and me, the beginning of a conversation. It is a truth universally acknowledged. And we can perhaps, even if we are so different, we share this. So there's something of a common language. We are speaking English here, with our accents, but this is a common ground for us. So, but besides this idea of the canonical works, I also try to talk to my students and my peers also about that our methods of teaching, and I'm insisting on teaching because I think teaching is such a direct result of all these reflections we have. I think there's such a big impact on our classrooms and on our transmission. But our ways of working, our methodologies, they can be canonical or anti-canonical, no matter what materials we teach. So we can invent non-canonical approaches to very canonical texts. So there is something canonical also about methods and ways of teaching, which I think is pretty worth thinking about. And then recently, because of this threat or this ghost of cancellation of the canon, and I feel affected by that, but perhaps it's a little paranoia also, yeah. But I've been making a joke, which is a little vulgar, but I'm going to share with you. In Portuguese, we have that expression, entrar pelo cano. I don't know how to explain this in English. To get into trouble. A cano in Portuguese is a pipe. So if you go into a pipe, you are tight, squeezed, a hard situation. Cano is very close to cânone in Portuguese. So I've been telling my students, vamos entrar pelo cânone, gente. Yeah, vamos entrar pelo cânone. Because even if you think about Shakespeare, to get out of trouble, that's it. No, I mean, not being afraid nor prejudiced about the canon, because even in the case of Shakespeare, for example, what is really canonical in Shakespeare is a very small portion of his work. Nobody reads The Rape of Lucrece, or nobody reads Cymbeline, only João Cezar, yeah, and me. Nobody reads Pericles, yeah. Titus Andronicus, until very recently, was like, oh, it's a trash play. So what is canonical about Shakespeare is a very small portion of his work. Yeah, about 10 plays within the 38 he wrote or he composed. So I think we have to face this also. Yeah, that if we are going to talk about the canon, let's get to know it in full, yeah, in order to express our like or our dislike for it. Yeah. So I don't know if I still have time, but just to round up. There was a film released in 2020, a film called Nomadland. Yeah, Frances McDormand was the protagonist. The director is a Chinese-American woman. And the film won the Oscar for Best Film and I think Best Actress for McDormand. But it was during the pandemic, so nobody was going to the movies then. So the film was sort of, it went unnoticed, or at least it didn't deserve as much attention as it should. Nomadland. I forget the name in Portuguese now. So there was a novel, and then the novel was adapted, and the film was made. And McDormand is the protagonist. She was a former tutor of secondary school tutor in English. So her little town in the U.S. was closed down because the factory that existed there was shut down. Everybody lost their jobs, and the zip code of the town disappeared, was erased. So everybody, it's a film about the nomads, people that live on trailers, motorhomes, traveling around, after the 2008 crisis. So that's the context. And McDormand, her character, she's a widow, and, she's driving her van. She calls Vanguard. She entitles her van. And one of the things she carries, she can take very few things with her because she had to put down her house and leave a lot of things behind, but is Shakespeare. But the name Shakespeare is never mentioned in the film, yeah? But there are a few situations in the film in which she comes across other travelers, and she talks about a sonnet that she knows by heart, but never mentioning the author, and the one she says the sonnet to is quite touched by that experience of the language. Once she bumps into an ex-student of hers, and she asks the girl, "Do you still remember something from our classes back then at school?" And the girl says, "Yes, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow." Creeps in this petty pace to the last syllable of recorded time. The girl says something like that from the tomorrow and tomorrow. And Frances McDormand's eyes are full of tears because there's a moment of contact with someone through Shakespeare, but the name is never mentioned. And I was thinking about, and I was quite touched. I didn't expect that in the film when I started watching it. I knew nothing about the film, and I was I felt part of that somehow. And then I said, it's always going to be very highbrow, yeah, to know something from a foreign literature, a canonical author. But on the other hand, it's so contact-provoking also, yeah, independently of the name. So there was not the brand of Shakespeare in the film. There were the words, some vestiges of Shakespeare. Yeah? I'm sorry, that's all I have to say. João, thank you very much.
May I? Yeah? So I'm Larissa. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UF with Professor Jobim. So I'll start with the question. Oh, thank you so much. That was sent by Professor João Cezar. How do Brazilian and Chinese scholars read canonical works from the Western tradition? We have not yet fully explored the theoretical implications of this anthropological gaze. For instance, we cannot naturalize the other. Therefore, our critical approach tends to be particularly sharp. To reflect on this question posed by Professor, I propose that, 1, we consider that in the transnational context of reading and critical reception, the revival of the concept of world literature, which would illustrate certain cultural exchanges and transfers, tells us more about Western logocentrisms than about a condition of denaturalizing dominant knowledge. And 2, that the geoculture of the modern world system is still structured according to relations of coloniality, of power and knowledge. So in the face of the persistence of a structure of symbolic representation of theoretical, epistemological, and hermeneutical violence, what can be done? If you consider that all thought is conditioned by the space from which it is constructed, the question initially raised by João Cezar is now extended with this complement, may find its theoretical answer in the legacies and contributions of our own comparative mode. A comparative mode that may allow us to decolonize academic culture, re-articulating subaltern and hegemonic knowledge according to the potentialities of a comparative literature produced here in Latin America. Obviously, this is not about sustaining the older propositions of an inside and outside, but about challenging the referential values existing in dichotomies that still permeate literary studies. In this sense, we believe that the act of reading canonical works from the Western tradition presupposes a model of entry, a consideration of theories that permeate the understanding of the performativity of cultures. And we don't need to embark on a long journey to find the theories. Even if we did, perhaps, the landscapes encountered and sketched by the gaze of Rocha, Moreira, and Casanova, authors present in the contemporary debate of the literary scene, would tell us more about a comparative mode that failed to revisit the dominant logic of notions of modernity and cosmopolitanism, and that became confined to cultural dialectic. In this scene, more than simply reversing a dominant logic of reading, it is essential to undertake a decolonization of academic culture and its reception. This process must be one of the constant discovery and self-critique. Must be one of constant discovery and self-critique, not about exclusion. A process that, in speaking of circulation and cultural exchanges, observes in the other, and this other can be like theory, methodologies, or even the literary discourse, a resource for understanding the self. Going further, what is at stake in the current globalized scenario of intensified cultural exchanges and transfers concerns not only what is known, but the production of knowledge itself, and the urgent need to relocate and question what Mignolo has tried to show as a kind of Western canon of knowledge, a place of discourse authorized to define certain objects and subjects, a place where Occidentalism is the dominant geopolitical system. So Evelek pointed out that the world was in a state of crisis because we were unable to establish a distinct object of study and a specific methodology. We would update his observation in the form of a paraphrase. The world remains in crisis because the cultural asymmetrics that constitute the reception and the mode of reading texts from other cultural spaces are still institutionalized in the major hegemonic century. At this point, we return to the initial question that opened those considerations. And what does our place of enunciation tell us? How does the comparativism developed here allow us to offer another epistemological perspective of complicity between knowledge and the other? It is in this sense that we would like to highlight the pertinence of the idea of anthropophagy, the circulation between the Americas and Europe. Even situated in specific moments of our literary historiography, this idea can be taken as a path for critical reading and reception, not only of literary texts, but also of theoretical ones. In a dialogical movement of difference, the rearticulation in English of Shakespeare's phrase, to be or not to be, that is the question that Professor Jobim once had studied a lot about that, and according to Professor Jobim, promotes a displacement of meaning in relation to Hamlet's test. In to be or not to be, that is the question, according to Professor Jobim. The reference in the indigenous peoples who lived in Brazil in the 18th century is characterized by a rupture with certain narrative, where the main actor, the principle of nationality, was merely a euphemism for the process of assimilation of people. And as a critical discourse on the performative character of the strategies of creation and singular appropriation of nationalism, I'll quote Professor Jobim, the criteria of truth and reason formulated in European countries and transferred to the Americans would also have to undergo modifications in their next context. So let me just go here not to waste so much time here. So in this following that idea that was presented by Professor Jobim, the other, the different, is now placed on a common basis from which the I can transform itself through it, transform itself into another I, not see oneself in the other, but see the other in oneself, according to Castro. And it is in this sense that we believe that the anthropophagic gesture institutes what would be a key element in answering the question, how do Brazilian and Chinese scholars read canonical works from the Western tradition? In other words, as a process of recognition that would displace identities culturally and politically constructed. So within the historical and aesthetic horizons in which the notion of Otto Andrade was constructed, the practice of digesting what was considered culturally universal is like a possible path for the reception and critique of the other, situated in the sphere of recognition. So since reality is socially constructed, we observe that only the understanding of the place from which we are constituted and from which we constitute the meaning of our own actions and our own relations can be a way to understand the culture. Just what Derrida said, the process of splitting, of which the difference or differences would be the constituted products or effect. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Larissa. Now I invite José Rangel.
So, hi everyone. My name is José Luiz. I am PhD candidate in literary studies at UERJ, State University of Rio de Janeiro. And I conduct research under the supervision of Professor João Cezar de Castro Rocha. So I will jump into the text right now in order to manage time better. Well, in her article, The Land Between, Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk explores Socrates' characterization of reality in the Symposium, drawing from his mentor Diotimos' ideas. Tokarczuk describes this as, I quote her, a non-dualistic continuum in which certain states of being are separated by zones in between, end quote. A similar concept emerged over a century ago when Jung proposed that the human psyche comprises two interpenetrating regions, one of external perceptions and another he termed the unconscious. Tokarczuk, however, points out that Friedrich Schiller was the first to articulate this intuition more precisely, asserting that, I quote her again, only art was capable of connecting these two parallel worlds, end quote. Socrates refers to this in-between as metaxy, the Greek term for the intermediary space where Eros, son of wealth and poverty, resides according to the Platonic myth. Tokarczuk suggests that the wealth-poverty pair can be interpreted metaphorically as, I quote, nothing and everything, simplicity and complexity, mortality and eternity, partiality and fullness, immanence and transcendence, end quote. Eros thus occupies this fertile ground between opposites, without necessarily neutralizing them. A being neither mortal nor immortal. This state of being neither human nor God is the condition of the daimonion, explained the author of Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. She further notes, I quote, because of this position between opposites, the true nature of Eros is in fact desire, end quote. To better situate the realm of fiction, Tokarczuk turns to Hans Feiringer's 1911 classic, The Philosophy of As If. She distills Feiringer's proposition, and I quote her again, since we cannot truly and fully know the reality in which we live, we have to hypothesize about it and base ourselves on suppositions about its nature, end of quote. Tokarczuk then suggests that fiction operates between metaxy and the as if, distinguishing these concepts. I quote her again, although both spheres are equally dynamic, the concept of as if is distinguished from that of metaxy by the fact that the latter is a given space existing a priori, whereas the former is subject to constant creation. End of quotation. In essence, while the as if reorders our conceptions of reality, metaxy functions between opposites, fostering an understanding distinct from analytical cognition. The Canadian critic Northrop Frye proposed similar ideas in works such as The Educated Imagination from 1963. He posited that literature springs from the imagination yearns to conceive a habitable world for humanity. From this point, we can draw connections to the work of Canadian classicist Anne Carson. In her article, The Creation, Carson examines the creation, how women like Sappho, Marguerite Porete, and Simone Weil tell God, Carson examines excerpts from the poetry of these three authors, revealing a triangular image of jealousy. In Seifu's work, this geometric figure places the lyrical self at one vertex, the beloved at another, and between them a third figure, the object of the beloved's desire. Poet's version is more complex. The lyric self occupies one vertex, God another, and Poet herself stands between them. Carson notes that both Sappho and Poet employs this triangulation of jealousy, where the third element creates tension between the beloved and the lyric self. In Weil's work, this tripod reaches its peak complexity. Carson explains that Weil coins a neologism to describe the act of giving back to God what he given her own self. Weil terms this gesture decreation. Carson highlights the paradox of being deprived of one's own self. She observes that the three subjects turn to poetic language in an attempt to, I quote her, tell the world the truth about God, love, and reality. The metaphor of creation is also fundamental to Frei's thought, which he explored in his 1980 book called Creation and Recreation. Frei uses the term recreation as a simplification of what he considered more accurately described as decreation. In a tentative manner, I attempted to connect the concepts of Frei and Weil/Carson. As Carson notes, Weil's use of the term decreation is imprecise, and she doesn't even maintain consistent spelling of the word. In Frei's view, creation can be understood as the raw material found in the world, while recreation is what human beings make from this material. Drawing from Oscar Wilde's essay, The Truth of Masks, Frei notes that humans inhabited an envelope, typically called culture, constructed from nature. However, he challenges the romantic notion of creative alienation through a return to nature as illusory, arguing that even our concept of nature as a teacher is a human construct. To support this, Frei invokes Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico, principle of verum factum, which posits that we only truly understand what we create. Thus, any idea of nature as a human construct could only reveal its absolute otherness to us. Frei proposes a metaphor to this envelope that separates us from nature, which will allow me to connect him to his compatriot and Carson. I beg your pardon for a lengthy quote in which the Canadian critic described his image. Our envelope, as I have called it, the cultural insulation that separates us from nature, is rather like the window of a railway carriage at night. Most of the time, it is a mirror of our own concerns, including our concern about nature. As a mirror, it fills us with the sense that the world is something which exists primarily in the reference to us. It was created for us, we are the center of it, and the whole point of its existence. But occasionally, the mirror turns into a real window through which we can see only the vision of an indifferent nature that got along for untold eons of times without us, seems to have produced us only by accident, and, if it were conscious, could only regret having done so. End of quotation. And he continues, I quote him again, the cultural aura, or whatever it is that insulates us from nature, consists, among other things, of words. The verbal part of it, it's what I call a mythology, or the total structure of human creation conveyed by words with literature at its center. End of quotation. It's challenging to encapsulate the entire argument here. My interpretation suggests that the work of art can be viewed as both creation and recreation, given that we cannot separate our cultural conditioning from artistic creations. This perspective requires a conceptual leap, proposing that the finished product, such as a literary work, is creation, while its reception becomes recreation. However, every author also recreates as they are expected to be a reader. Therefore, I suggest the creation and recreation in Fry's framework as intrinsically linked to artistic production and reception. The creation in Weil's thought, as presented by Carson, is simultaneously distinct yet not entirely unrelated. For Weil, it concerns the annihilation of the self, an ultimately impossible act except through metaphor. Carson highlights the difficulty of this gesture in the verse of her chosen three poets that I provide a few examples shortly. Seifel, realizing that the object of her desire loves another, writes, I quote her, a cold sweat covers me, trembling seizes my body, and I'm greening than grass. I seem but a breath away from death. End of quotation. Poet, as Carson notes, describes her impoverishment as a condition of physical and metaphysical negation with these lines, I quote, now the soul is nothing, for it perceives its own nothingness through the abundance of divine understanding, which renders it nothing and plunges it into nothingness. End of quotation. Weil, in her quest to disappear and truly observe, writes, I quote, if only I could see a landscape as it is when I'm not there. But where I am, I disturb the silence with my heartbeat. End of quotation. So far, I focus only on the liminal space of fiction, attempting to illuminate the connection between eros and fiction as explored by Carson, Tokarczuk, and Fry. However, I've said little about our position as distant readers. Although it's not yet possible to fully synthesize this reflection, I will turn again once more to Olga Tokarczuk to suggest a tentative conclusion regarding the concept of literary reading from the periphery. I now turn to Tokarczuk lectures given on the occasion of her 2018 Nobel Prize for Literature, entitled The Tender Narrator. In it, she highlights the complexity of contemporary experience, which no longer centers on literary narrative. In essence, we are dealing with a non-hegemonic form of culture itself. Yet language remains the crucial means of decoding experience. This is why Tokarczuk emphasizes the need for new storytelling forms capable of reconnecting us with the experiences we're missing. She states, I quote, I believe that myth performs the function of that structure. Everyone knows that myths never really happened, but are always going on. End of quote. I hope you indulge me with another lengthy quote from Tokarczuk. I quote her, it is possible that the novel and literature in general are becoming before our very eyes something actually quite marginal in comparison with other forms of narration. that the weight of the image of new forms of directly transmitting experience, film, photograph, virtual reality, will constitute a viable alternative to traditional reading. Reading is quite a complicated psychological and perceptual process. And I want to stress this line. Reading is quite a complicated psychological and perceptual process. To put it simply, first, the most elusive content is conceptualized and verbalized, transforming into signs and symbols, and then it is decoded back from language into experience. That requires a certain intellectual competence, and above all, it demands attention and focus, abilities ever rarer in today's extremely distracting world. End of quotation. Well, drawing from the concepts presented here, namely metaxy and as if, as realms of eros, or the desire for fiction, arising from the opposition between wealth and poverty, or between nothing and everything, as well as the productive tension between recreation in fry and decreation in Carson/Veil, we can envision creative approaches to situating literary reading in non-hegemonic contexts. In this presentation, I attempt to give initial shape to ideas on my reflective horizon, formulated in the moment for this event. I hope, at the very least, to have sparked our debate.
Let me try to wrap up some of our conversation, not to produce a synthesis, but just to provoke another conversation. And once more, Maria, Carmen, Eduardo, André, Antonio, Leonardo, Renato, you are all invited to engage in our conversation. Let me try to bring together Professors Jen Haiyan and Larissa Moreira. I would like to listen a bit more, especially of Professor Jen Haiyan, of concept that I found fascinating. I just want to make sure that I understood. Or if I have not understood properly, I imagined beautifully. You mentioned this fundamental writer that is all over our book, the book we edited, Lu Xun, and the concept, and I was very much attracted by, did you say Nalai? Nalai. And then it became a sort of, not a concept, but also sort of a conceptual framework, Nalaism. Did I understand it correctly? Yeah. Ah, I see. That's what so, I see, not an isolated concept, but actually a conceptual framework, more than just a concept. And then you just said, I was really fascinated by that actually this concept allowed an attitude of, instead of shutting doors, to actually to take over things from outside to build a different, new, larger house mansion. And then you said that actually Nalaism would be a selective assimilation of what is foreign, of otherness, in order to produce a self-improvement thanks to the widening of the existential horizon. Is that so? Yeah. Have I understood correctly? Yeah, absolutely. So my imagination was, it's the target. I just found it fascinating. Of course, all the Brazilians already know where I'm arriving at. Because then Larissa Moreira Fidalgo, because I know her work, she has a very important work on the concept of word literature and how, in spite of the fact that this aims at enlarging the canon, when you see the anthologies produced by David Damrosch and others, that actually they keep on being really Eurocentric. Once in a while you have a different author, you have the presence of some alterity, but mainly they keep on being very canonical in a traditional sense. And then Larissa said that an alternative would be to reconsider the anthropophagic gesture. I think that you with different words, from afar, you are very close. And then I'm just asking you to have a dialogue afterwards. And also I'd like to bring together Professor Jobim and Professor Fernanda Medeiros and see if it works as well for further conversation. Because Professor Jobim, I think you raised a very important issue concerning canon. That sometimes, and I have to say, I'm to be blamed for, because we just say Western canon, and we naturalize it as a monument. But then you told us very sharply that actually, and you said, in the case of Chinese and Brazilian universities and academic researchers, we have to address a fundamental question. There isn't such thing as a Western canon. There isn't something as a West. There isn't something as a canon. They always depend on public and policies that most of the times are not culturally determined, but politically, economically, geographically, for all the reasons. So I think that the way Professor Jobim brings the issue of the canon, not allowing us to naturalize the Western canon, but to realize that actually the Western canon itself is already a very strict selection of a wide possibility. And if I understood correctly, I think that we can tie up the strings of Professor Fernanda Medeiros' contribution to our conversation. I was fascinated by the idea, Fernanda, that we can also see, of course we can be very critical, and we should be very critical concerning the canon, whenever the canon is naturalized, whenever one does not acknowledge that the construction of the canon is a construction. It is not anything given. It has to be constructed. But then you said something that really surprised me. I have never thought of the canon as potentially a universal language for the beginning of a conversation. I thought it was a very interesting way of seeing it. And you complemented with a very sharp observation that nothing prevents us from teaching non-canonically the canon. I think that brings together your observation with Professor Jobim's remarks. So I think that we'll have a conversation there. And I was really surprised with Professor José Luis Rangel's contribution. First of all, I have to say that I was enchanted that you quoted the Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk. Thank you. Because I could not have written any of the things I wrote on Shakespearean cultures, poetical formulation, without one Polish writer. That changed my life. I was at Stanford, and I was having a conversation with René Girard, and he told me, there is this author that you have to read. I said, who? I was eager. Who, Professor, who? He said, I don't remember the name. But he's so important. He was so important to me. Said, but who is this guy? He said, I only remember that he's Polish. Jan Koot. And then I started reading Jan Koot ages ago, and I was fascinated by this essay on Hamlet. The first sentence to me was a groundbreaking experience. This sort of transformation that only reading produces. You remember he says like a... Yes, it goes like this. The critic...
Yes, it is the title Hamlet of the mid-century.
The critical fortune on Hamlet is as thick as the telephone address book of Warsaw's telephone address book. And that changed my life, because it was possible to compare Hamlet to the telephone address book of Warsaw and then make a completely different reading of Hamlet. So reading Shakespeare from Warsaw, reading Shakespeare from Cyprus. But what really fascinated me is that René Girard, that he knew all the names of every single author he worked with, he could not remember the name of the Polish writer. He would not have forgotten if Jan Koot were German, French, American, but he was a Polish writer. So while listening to José Luis, and I want to listen more, José Luis, of you and of course of everyone else, is that of course we can develop a theoretical framework departing from our special place, our special location, but we are not obliged to. We are not obliged to do it. We can legitimately, as José Luis does, develop a theoretical concern on autopsy, regardless of the fact that José Luiz is Brazilian, not Afar is Canadian. He could have been offering the philosopher of as if. So I think that was a very important moment to me, because we have to be cautious. If we are not going to naturalize the Western canon, we cannot naturalize our own location as well. It's always relative, and nothing obliges us to develop a theoretical framework based from afar just because we are from afar. So I think that in that sense, José Luiz was a very nice touch to reminding us precisely what Professor Jobim and Professor Fernanda said. The Western canon in itself, it is not a given. It is also a construct, and we have to see it as such. So many things. Well, I really enjoyed tremendously the conversation. Now it's up to you. Please. I'm just ask all of you to identify yourselves just because of the recording, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Carmen Teresa Elias. I'm retired as a teacher. I was an English teacher, literature teacher. I'm retired, but I still love it. That's why I'm here. And I didn't prepare anything, so my ideas are all scattered. First thing I'd like to say, I heard from a Chinese professor once that we in the West, we look for differences while Chinese thought concentrates on similarities. And it changed completely the idea. I used to read books and I used to interpret life in itself. And I started thinking about similarities. And why do we have to make literature all separated? Like you mentioned, the Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare. Of course, I taught Shakespeare. Why can we not use Shakespeare anymore? Because it's not modern anymore. The problem is, there is no such a thing as old and new, because we are all talking about something much stronger. There is a human crisis. All of us, any one of us, anywhere in the world, our lives are composed of crisis. We all suffer the same. We may express it differently, but what is central in life is the problems we have to face, right? So I cannot understand why people take so much time questioning Capitu, which is a character from a famous Brazilian writer, which talks about jealousy. But we don't talk about Capitu and Othello and Medea, because the three talk about the same problem, which is jealousy, the limits of what would be acceptable as something natural and what becomes pathological, what becomes a disease, a mental disease. So why do we have to study? Why cannot go to Medea and Capitu? Why not? Why do we have to stay only here and now? Because the idea I have in Brazil nowadays regarding literature is that we have to talk about here and now. And here and now, in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, means the difficulties, the economical, the social crisis of people who live in peripheral areas. And it's the same we have had all over the world, all over human history. So if we consider texts from Greeks up to now, we have the same similarities. The other time, once I was hearing an opera, which is Aida, and there is a chant in Aida which is called the slavery chant, né? o canto dos escravos. Why can we not compare it to Navio Negreiro and to all the problems of colonization which are now in focus in Brazil? Why do Brazilian actual literary scenery has to be so apart from all the scenery of the world we have had in human history. So this is the reason why I think that we have to go through the canon. It's not that we have to go into. We are in a kind of open space, and we have to go through the canon so that we can go out on the other side, but having your baggage. We need baggage. Human nature, human life needs luggage, baggage of everything that has been done so far. I'm pretty much afraid of this. Pretty much afraid. It is destroying language. It has destroyed the literature. It is destroying our identity. The point I mean is that identity nowadays is fake. Because I can change myself. I must have an avatar. Every time I open it up, it offers me an avatar, which is not me. It's like Frankenstein. So I have to go to Mary Shelley and read Frankenstein to understand why I have to be made of pieces that can change my face, my hair, my eyes, that can change everything. And I have to accept it as reality. So this is the point. I would go farther, but I have nothing prepared about it. But the point is, we need the whole of humanity, the whole of literature. And I'm pretty much upset when I try to mention something canonical, and people just start attacking me. For instance, just to finish, I have written a book about Camões, which is a Portuguese writer. His 500th birthday this year. And without reading anything I had put on that book, 4 people had said that I'm just repeating the colony. Oh, why are you writing about Camões? Because you are simply playing the role of the colonizer. Do you know what I did? I didn't say anything at all. There is first of all, if you take Camões' poems, they talk about love, which is exactly the same as you have in Brazilian songs from sertanejo. Brazilian song which mention the sadness of love. That's what we have 500 years ago. And there is a chant called Ilha dos Amores, Love Island. In that island, Portuguese arrive, and there are nymphs ready to receive them for a sexual pleasure. They are not in continent anymore. They are not in Portugal anymore. They are on an island that does not exist on maps, a fantastic island, and there they can have all pleasure they want with these nymphs, which are not Portuguese women. So that's exactly what happens when they come to Brazil, right? Brazilian women, Indians or whatever, Brazilian women are not from the continent. They are not Portuguese. So they are just as the nymphs. We can do what we want with them. And what's the truth we have now? Brazil is seen as a country for prostitution and for sexual pleasure. Foreigners come here looking for those nymphs. So when I read Camões, what I'm reading is what I not mean purposefully, but I mean, let's say, what's unconsciously was hiding there in Portuguese mind when they arrived at a new land. So I have to read that to understand why people say what Brazil is. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much. No, thank you. Eduardo, if you want to say something, please. We all want to listen your words. So.
Você traduz para mim alguma coisa?
Larissa. Larissa is brilliant. No, she's really... Larissa.
Você já foi brilhante, eu já vi o seu brilho e outro tava.
Pay attention how brilliant she is. Go ahead.
Gente, a responsabilidade tão grande que eu vou fazer um carro. What a big responsibility, so I'm not Oh my God.
No, you have to translate from here. No, from here, no. You are going to translate, Eduardo. Come here, yes, come here. You don't have to translate Haiyan's English, it's perfect.
Não, eu vou para lá, vai.
Unless Larissa also translates from Mandarin into English. I would be surprised.
Really? Oh, that's something new for me.
Bem, sou o professor Eduardo Guerreiro Losso, da Faculdade de Letras da FRJ, Departamento do Programa de Ciência da Literatura. Espero não dar muito trabalho para a Larissa. Não vim preparado para falar inglês, só para ouvir. Me parece que a discussão sobre o cânon, ela sempre mobiliza os nossos esforços teóricos, né? Porque, ao mesmo tempo em que a gente ama a literatura, que é chamada de cânon, né? Se a gente gosta de literatura, se a gente estuda literatura, a gente estuda Shakespeare, a gente estuda Jane Austen, a gente estuda Machado de Assis, eu estou estudando Cruz e Souza. E, ao mesmo tempo, essa tradição canônica ocidental, ela é feita de instituições. O que eu, às vezes, sinto falta nessas discussões é como pensar que o papel da escrita e da alfabetização ela é fundamental em todo esse caminho de mediação para chegar a essa literatura escrita. Então, a escrita, a educação da escrita, ela possibilita o nosso gosto pela literatura, o nosso estudo pela literatura, mas ela também filtra acesso a tudo isso, né? E esse acesso ele não se torna mais facilitado por isso aqui. Infelizmente. A gente gostaria que fosse assim, mas não se torna, né? Eu gostei muito da sua intervenção, professora Fernanda, quando você falou, o João Cezar já repetiu, eu vou repetir mais uma vez, porque eu anotei, né, a sua intervenção quando disse que o Shakespeare é uma possibilidade de língua comum entre nós, né? Quer dizer, esse acesso difícil a esse cânon, a essa cultura escrita, com todas essas instituições, etc., ao mesmo tempo, ele nos dá uma possibilidade de linguagem comum, né? Então, acho que a dificuldade aqui está se dando em torno assim, da naturalidade da linguagem oral, mas que é muito dispersiva. Ela depende de línguas, de dialetos, de localizações e tal. E a padronização de grandes línguas, chinês, inglês, francês, português, né? E quando sempre se diz, não termos um olhar canônico para o cânon, né? Isso que foi repetido muito aqui, né? Implica em não se colocar uma visão autoritária, né, nesse contínuo dessa educação, me parece, né? No final das contas, o que a gente está procurando aqui é mostrar como que esse cânon, esses clássicos, né, acho que é um termo... Clássicos me parece assim mais simpático, né? E cânon é um xingamento, né? A dificuldade é mostrar como que esse cânon, com esse caminho tão difícil para chegar lá e ler o Shakespeare no original, né, e ler o Goethe em alemão no original, como que esse caminho tão difícil ele pode ser crítico? Em primeiro lugar, ele é uma língua comum, ele pode ser uma língua comum, ele pode nos ajudar ao diálogo das culturas, e como ele pode ser crítico a esse sistema autoritário, né? Agora, esse sistema ele foi autoritário ao longo dos séculos porque ele vem de uma cultura ocidental que não começa sendo democrática, começa sendo não começa sendo republicana, né? Começa sendo uma cultura de reis, rainhas, entendeu? Né? Uma cultura de nobreza versus povo. Então, a desconstrução democrática ela é complicada, porque começa sendo assim, né? Então, enfim. Desculpa te dar tanto trabalho, Larissa. Desculpa.
May I?
Faz resumo.
I'm going to try, okay?
Trust her.
It's something with them.
Larissa, we trust.
Oh my God. So the professor, yeah, he's a professor at UERJ, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, right? In the Department of Science of Literature. And the discussion that he is presenting to us is about how this debate concerning canon always involves a kind of effort, theoretical efforts, because we do enjoy literature. Yeah, we tend to read classical authors like Cruz de Souza, yeah, and we also read the Western tradition that was built and is, constantly built by institution. And in order to have a good reception of canon, the role of teaching is kind of essential. That's something we cannot forget. So what he said, it was something about that language is essential because it shows us, the world of literature. But on the other hand, that kind of modernity, the cell phone, is making things a little bit hard. So how can we keep reading the classical literature, that for him is a friendly concept, and canon was something like a bad word. So in this modernity world, we need to be critical, and concerning the way we read, and because this reading helps us, to construct the dialogue between cultures. So is it possible, not only due to modernity and technology, but also concerning about democratic institution, can we deconstruct this kind of reading? And was I clear?
Wow.
Really?
Very good. So, Haiyan, Fernanda, Jobim, José Luiz, Larissa, you want to add something? Or Haiyan, please. No, only if you want to. Sometimes I even believe in democracy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, because I think this is really thought-provocative, because I know that the topic of canon and circulation translation are heatedly discussed topics in world literature. But what you just mentioned brought it to mind that for the Chinese, the canon may mean something different. Because I remember I told João that our children, when they go to school at primary level, they were supposed to go there really early and do morning reading. And what they read is the canon. And this canon in the classicals, in the Chinese sense. And in our tradition, this is something established. And it's not that easy to change. So it's a little bit different from the Western concept of the canon. And the modern Chinese novelists nowadays, we do not call them canonical writers. Other than Lu Xun, he's been part of the canon. But for the others, we say we still need more time for the history to decide if they belong to a part of the canon or not. But and when we talk about the canon, we think like Book of Songs that was composed 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So that's what we mean by canon. So this is a little bit different situation. So this is, And this is what I would like to say about canon. And also, the formation of the canon in the West, I think there are lots of. I totally agree with Robin's idea that it's a mobile, it's a liquid concept, it's a dynamic concept, it's not a fixed one. So this is something very different, and I really appreciate that. Yeah, and really inspired by what you talk about. Thank you.
Thank you. Fernanda? You want to add something?
I'm not sure, but I think perhaps you and Jobim can develop this better. I'm not sure, Haiyan, if our idea of canon is that mobile in the West, or if we would like it to be, or if we try to make it because we are peripheral, and the canon is something far from us, in the sense that it's much more Anglophone or Francophone than Lusophone. I think we would like it to be something, a permanent object of discussion. But I'm not sure that it's that mobile as it might have seemed by our talks. I don't know. What do you think, Jobim, João?
Well, first of all, I would like just to remind us that the word canon, it was a contribution for the debate in our field. Why is it? Because before the use of the word canon in literary studies in the Western part of our world, what happened is that courses like in the US about great books, the great books were like, you would ask, well, why are these great books and not the other ones that I would consider great? There was no reason for this. The idea was that this was crystallized, that it was like something that was forever like this and will be forever like this. So the introduction of this word canon in the Western literary studies was a contribution to open the debate, and it was not let's say it was not something no, the idea is that it was not par hasard. It was not par hasard. I'm mixing French and English. It was not accidentally. It was not by chance. That's it. It was not by chance that it was introduced. Because, as a matter of fact, the universities in the Western part of our world are responsible for this. And as we know, for instance, the debate about the canon in Stanford in the 60s was fundamental for the discussion, meaning they said, well, we have students who are coming to Stanford, and those students are basically Hispanic, which in the United States means Mexican or Indian descendants. I mean this because when I was there, when I lived there in California, I received a form by the motor vehicles. I don't remember what was it. It was a correspondent to the Detran in Brazil, and it was about what was my race. And the first category was Pacific Islander. Pacific Islander. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't exist as a category in Brazil or in the Portuguese world. And the second was African American, and the third was Hispanic. And then I said, well, Hispanic, Spain, Portuguese, maybe. And then there was this observation, except Brazilian and Portuguese. So, it's a way of seeing things, but what I mean is that the debate was open, and it allowed other visions. And this allowance was also based on a very specific university problem, which is you have a curriculum and you can't put everything in it. So in a way, you will have to select. Whatever it is that you do, it will be a selection. So it's about this in the end. And I remember that Frank Kermode, the famous English British critic, he said, well, the discussion is not about the canon, it's about who has the power to put in the canon whoever he wants to. So, and he's right, because at that time people use canon as a bad word. They say, well, okay, but it's selection, there's always selection. There's no way to be out of a world in which selections are made, beginning with the selections made in the university curriculum. That's it.
Just a contribution, since Fernanda mentioned. I was thinking of the latest book published by John Longsi, and the title is World Literature as Discovery, Expanding the World Literary Canon. And something that Longsi proposes, in a way, relates to what Eduardo Losso, Jan Haiyan, and Fernanda Medeiros mentioned, also with Jobim's reflection. He proposes that the word literature will only become a viable methodological novelty, and he have worked quite a bit with the sense in which word literature was not that novelty. If we produce a return to the text, this is literally as he says it, returning to the text, to the literary text that has to be read literarily. And then he comes into a very polemical issue, which is deeply related to the very traditional notion of canon, which is the value judgment. And that has become a sort of fallacy in literary theory. In the past 40, 45 years, we have refused to discuss the question of literary value, literary judgment. And one of the reasons, according to Professor Eduardo Losso, one of the reasons why the canon may provide a universal language, as was proposed by Professor Fernanda, necessarily is related to that, to a certain quality or to a certain ability that a literary text may have so let's say in this way, to keep doors open for interpretation. Instead of shutting doors, instead of closing windows, a literary text that usually we see as canonical is a literary text that does not provide answers, but allows us to produce new questions. So there is some sort of quality which perhaps we should not say value judgment in the traditional sense, but we should say that there is some experience produced by certain texts that allows them, this quality allows the text to always be reread. That's the way, for instance, the Eliot, Kundera, and so many others have defined the classic. A classic is, or Calvino, a classic is a text whose answers were not given completely, or were never given, fully given, so we can always keep on asking questions to the text. The book just came out. I think this year. Came out in 2024. This book here, the word. Yeah. Let me see here.
Last year, the publication data says this year.
Because I have the books 2024, actually. Yeah, well, it says here 2024, but I see I have the book since last year because I taught it in Yunnan. Yes, a chapter, yeah, but 2024. According to, yeah, but 2023 is okay. It's fairly recent. Especially in a Chinese sense, it's fairly recent. And I think perhaps this is a book that we all could read. I have it in PDF, because this question is a very delicate question. Could we actually produce a new concept of word literature that instead of focusing on a list of texts or enlarging the list of texts, should we produce a return to the literary text and ask whether or not certain texts are able to produce ever new questions? So perhaps that would be a way to bring further our discussion, not to give any answer, but just to bring further our questions.
May I?
Of course. Just please just identify yourself.
Okay, my name is Maria Helena. I'm not one of yours on the literary field. I'm an architect. I work for the city of Rio de Janeiro. But as far as I heard everyone talk about the canon, I think it's very, very simple to resume what we heard here. Olga said, listen to your heartbeat. That's the canon. Hold hands. Nothing more.
If there is nothing more, I would invite you to celebrate. We have a reception in honor of Professor Jen Haiyan. We have some wine and cheese, and we can keep on talking outside. Is that all right? So thank you for this first conversation. If you want, I will send you the book by Zhuang Longxi. It is on literary canon. Thank you. Obrigado, Felipe.